After the two of them were done with Sheeda's preliminary introduction to humanity's past mistakes, and started to walk closely together back towards the main house of the compound, James began to take in his surroundings a bit more closely. He didn't say anything about it yet, but he definitely paid a bit closer attention about the condition of everything. He was a bit on edge after he had discovered the mountains of unprocessed donations when they arrived, as well as the somehow still standing Christmas decoration in the lobby. Sure, those two things themselves weren't a big deal. When mindfully done, those undone tasks took maybe an hour to complete at most. However, to him, there were signs of something worse possibly lying underneath, because those easy, quickly done, but not immediately important tasks were the ones that one could most easily let slip when things weren't going how they were supposed to. And the fact that he had seen how some of the donations had been opened to extract individual items from them was a hint that there had to have been a kink in the system somewhere. Why else would it not all have been brought to its proper place, and instead have been left to be rifled through every time you needed some of it? Well, at the very least he was relieved in, so far, that he had not spotted a single flaw in the actual care of the animals yet. They looked fed, healthy, and satisfyingly occupied. Everything was up to its usual standards there, so there was at least no emergency. That was good. However, that didn't mean his current looking around didn't tell him anything. For one, now that he paid attention to it, he spotted even more yet-to-be-removed decorations hanging around the place. Festoons, small wreaths, the odd ornament, and even small artificial trees could still be seen beautifying the place all over, but noticeably, only if one cared to look. Where these things were usually made to be large, colourful and eye-catching, so that they could fulfill their purposes as decoration, these were different, and it was mostly due to their placements. They all hung, laid, or stood either pretty out of the way or pretty high up, in dark corners or slightly buried and hidden by high snow or tall grass. Summed up, it was all those decorations that one might easily overlook, especially if one was in a hurry. "Everything all right?" Sheeda's voice suddenly ripped James out of his concentrated thought, most likely after she had seen his expression shift into a glummer one, the more he got into his own head over the odd occurrence. He blinked twice to regain his focus and slightly shook his head. "Yeah, everything's fine, Treasure," he said at first, although her sharp inquisitive eyes piercing right into him with their yellow gaze quickly convinced him that there was really no reason to beat around the bush here. Therefore he added earnestly, "I just noticed some work around the place that probably should have been done by now. I worked here so long that it comes kind of naturally to worry about that stuff." Seemingly satisfied that he spilled the beans so readily without her prying any further, Sheeda chuffed and nuzzled up to him a bit tighter. "Well, it's your choice how you want to spend your free time here," she said, taking tight hold of his arm. He chuckled. "Maybe I'll lend a bit of a hand," he admitted, and looked around again with a slow exhale, remembering everything he used to do around the place whenever he found the opportunity. Before his inner eye, he saw himself carting around meat and food, or clearing the ways of weeds, sometimes even driving the tractor for some heavier loads. These rows of enclosures and corridors of fences were once his home. Even if he had come here to relax, was there really any cutting loose from doing at least some work while he was here? That thought was only reinforced when they reached the main home. Following a hunch, James briefly diverted their course and led Sheeda behind the house, instead of towards the front door. The house itself stood basically in the centre of the compound, give or take a few meters, and it was surrounded by the only wide open area of the compound that did not specifically serve as an enclosure. Sometimes they referred to this area as the garden, although it really wasn't anything that fancy, just some area that was open for the occupants, or now occupant, singular, to use outside of the labour side of the compound. However, it was also where some important utilities, like for example the collection area for non-compostable garbage, was situated. And as if he had known it, when James led Sheeda around the house and towards a large semi-open shed behind it, what else did he find but a large pile of likely quickly gathered and crumpled up leftover Christmas decorations? Garlands, paper chains, and broken ornaments or display pieces were all piled up on the trash heap. Their untouched appearance and lack of any other trash on top were clear indicators that they had been a very recent addition, and honestly, it all looked to James like someone had just hastily thrown them on there. If he had to guess, half of the stuff probably hadn't even been broken before it had been tossed on here. And despite that, so much of it also still remained on the premises. Another very noticeable thing that seemed to interest Sheeta a lot more than the colourful pile of holiday trash was the large piece of heavy machinery standing tall in the snow. The very tractor James had been thinking about just earlier was parked, with its arm up high, right in the middle of the garden, behind the house, and in front of the shed. No tyre marks and a layer of frozen crystals coating its outside spoke of it not having been moved there as recently as the disposed rubbish. In fact, it sort of looked like it hadn't been moved much at all in recent times, and that despite the fact that it wasn't supposed to be here, its parking space was actually a good march away, closer to one of the outer fences. Yet here it stood, iced over and lonely out in the open, exposed to the elements. Sheeta looked up at the multi-ton colossus of metal with benign appreciation, while James could only wonder what it was doing here. Also, the long streaks of hot breath drawing clouds into the air as they shot out from between her teeth reminded him that it was probably really time that they went back inside at this point anyway. Therefore, he quickly pulled the feline along, hurrying towards the entrance, that was still easily unlocked by a single touch of his, even though he had technically moved out at this point. However, as he pulled the door open, Sheeta stopped him for a second before he could step inside. Right now, they were standing on a wide, individually roofed over step that formed a sort of way towards the door. Then Sheeta let go of him, stepping back away from the door and off the step, back onto the snowy, frozen ground, and she walked a couple more steps backward until she was something like 10 meters away from the house, with her head cranked all the way back into her neck as she looked up at it. After a moment of wondering, James quietly closed the door again and moved to join her. As he reached her, he also turned to look up at the ever-so-familiar domicile. The house was a fair size, and most of the outside walls were covered in a thick, white, insulating material that had a rough texture when seen or touched, and sounded quite hollow when knocked against. When looking at one of the many windows, you could see how thick the material was, as it stood out a fair bit from the frames and the glass. Above it, when looking up to the pointed roof that formed the second and third floor of the house, the flat side of the walls were instead covered in dark tiles that matched with the roofing tiles on the slanted sides of the roof. At one point, the roof was broken up by a sort of outlook being built into it, made of upright windows that provided a view of nearly that entire side of the compound when looking out through them. And not far from it, a tiny chimney also stuck out of the tiles. The air above it slightly distorted, as otherwise invisible, but heated gas came out of it. "This is a nice house," Sheeta finally informed him, after taking in the sights for a while, and she sounded both appreciative, surprised, and proud? James wasn't quite sure how exactly to interpret her exact tone. Maybe she was just glad he didn't live somewhere in a skyscraper in a tiny flat. "It is," he confirmed after a moment, and exhaled slowly while also taking it all in, taking a moment to appreciate it even though the sight had become so taken for granted to him over the many years. "Out of it all, I was especially lucky to have a place like this to grow up in." Sheeta nodded. "You were," she shamelessly confirmed for him, her tone not exactly jealous or anything, but definitely intended to remind him that he'd do well to remember that fact. However, it then turned a bit more wistful as she added, "This is a good place to be raised in." James's breath very briefly caught in his throat, as his mind started to pick up what she was putting down. However, he quickly recovered from it. "Yeah," he simply agreed, leaving it at that. Then he offered her his arm again. "Want to go inside?" Sheeta nodded, and quickly they entered through the front door. James briefly instructed on how to properly kick the snow and ice off her boots, before turning to hang up his and her coat, a wave of warm air immediately hitting his face as he entered the house's well-insulated walls. Well, warm air to him and relative to the outside, of course. Sheeta would have probably still preferred it quite a bit warmer than the 20-something degrees it was in here, but she was also wearing her thick clothes, so she would likely be fine. However, there was something else, something James hadn't expected since it usually wasn't like this. In the air lingered the tick smell of air freshener, and lots of it according to his nose. Immediately after stepping in, they came face to face with a mirror that was part of a large, wooden dresser area, that took up almost the entire wall of the corridor they entered into. To the right of the mirror, there was a large board with hooks to hang coats and other clothes on, while to its left there was a small grey, dirty rug that was used to momentarily leave your shoes if you either weren't staying long, or they weren't ready for the cabinet yet. Above said rug, there was a small row of shelves built into the wall, where things from your pockets like keys or wallets or other stuff for on the go could be left if so desired. The corridor then led in two directions. To the right would be a bathroom, a tiny supply closet, the stairs to the basement, and two private rooms. Flynn's, and at least what used to be James's own. To the left you could reach the large living room, dining room and kitchen combination, as well as the stairs leading upwards to the higher floors. That was the direction they were going first, after having peeled out of most of the no longer necessary winter clothes, like jackets, scarves and gloves, both of which only Shida had been wearing anyway. Walking into the large open room that had actually originally been 3 rooms, the walls in between of which had been torn down since, the first thing of note was the large dining room table made of light wood, and surrounded by a large number of matching chairs. Left of it, a small wall that didn't even go up to James's chest separated the kitchen that was made up of a quasi-rectangle of counters and appliances, made in a way that one could work all around themselves when busy cooking. The other direction led to a large red couch that took up an entire corner of the room with its longest side, facing towards a very wide screen on the other side of the room, that was situated right underneath the wooden stairs that led upwards. A much smaller table stood in the crook of said couch for convenience. The floor was mostly covered in white tiles, although between the couch and the screen, a large, dark, fringed carpet was laid out. And to its right, there was a number of cupboards and cabinets, one of which had windowed doors through which a number of finer glassware and porcelain could be seen. Sitting on chairs opposite of each other, at the long sides of the table and nursing mugs of steaming dark liquid, were Coco and Fynn, who had seemingly been locked into a mild conversation before James and Shida had entered. Their eyes now shot over to the new arrivals as they shuffled into the room, still getting used to the heat that had returned to the air around them. Shida was rubbing her shoulders with her hands, her body seemingly still stuck in the "it's way too freaking cold" status the outside world had given her, even through her protective clothes. "How was the tour?" Coco asked, and swayed her green mug for a moment while she leaned back in her chair. Her green eyes appreciatively scanned over both him and Shida, as they were ridding themselves of the last bits of unnecessary clothing. "As quick as it was informative," James replied, before he started to look around, finding the room pretty empty, apart from the 2 that had awaited them. "Where is everyone else?" Fynn took a long swig of his coffee, and let out a long, raspy sigh before lifting his gaze at James. "Sophie and her lover already went to her place. Apparently they have an early day tomorrow, so count yourself lucky," he informed his nephew with a hoarse chuckle, and then took another sip of his drink before he continued. "As to your sister, she took that friend of yours upstairs to show off something in her room." With that, he finally pushed his chair back a slight bit, and laboriously stood up with a slight groan before skulking over towards James with a slightly hunched posture, and his hands in his pockets at first, only taking them out to open his arms widely once he had reached them. In the dimmer light of the room, his face didn't look quite so worn anymore, and even the white sprinkle in his hair was less noticeable. James wrapped his arms around his uncle, and held him in a tight embrace for a long moment. "Welcome home, kiddo," Fynn said, and forcefully patted James's back, completely uncaring of the fact that James had moved out and, in fact, off-planet at this point. Then again, it wasn't like he really had a place to stay out there anymore either. The embrace ended in Fynn reaching for the side of James's head, pulling it down to his level so he could press a kiss on his nephew's forehead, before letting the much larger young man go, and turning towards his added company instead. He looked at her for a second, reading her expression and posture before candidly opening his arms again, although the embrace this time was a lot more offered and a lot less demanded. She'd seemed to think it through for a moment, but ultimately, she too unfolded her still warmingly rubbing arms, and wrapped them around the older gentleman, although differently from her boyfriend. She stood slightly shorter than him. "And welcome to our home, Shida," Fynn said quietly as he held her, clearly mindful of the fact that he was right next to her sensitive ear. Then he laughed slightly, as he pulled away but kept his hands on her shoulders for a second. "Feel free to make yourself as comfortable as you like," he humorously added as he looked into her eyes. "But do me a favour. If you and that big lug over there ever pick up a brat anywhere, please don't pawn it off on me. 3 really is enough." James chuckled awkwardly along with him, while Sheeta's gaze turned amusedly confused, and you could read off her expression that she was counting out his children in her head, with 3 likely not being the conclusion that she was reaching. "Don't forget Sophie," Fynn said, apparently noticing the very same thing that James did, and gave her a large brief pat on the shoulder before letting go of her and stepping back. "I raised her too." For a moment she still seemed confused, but only for presumably the time it took for her brain to make the connection between Admiral Sophia Krieger and Sophie, Flynn Krieger's little sister. "Well, could you blame them if they tried?" Coco suddenly chimed into the conversation from back of the table, although she had fully turned towards them at this point. "With your track record, it seems abandoning a child with you is a recipe for success. Just look at them all." James rolled his eyes, but Flynn chuckled. "I'll take it as a compliment," he said, and gradually turned to walk back to the table, waving for James and Sheeta to come along, before planting his hands back in his pockets. "But with my track record, I'll probably keel over dead before managing to raise even one more squirt past puberty." He made the joke in good faith, but James still felt a slight sting in the back of his mind as he heard it, especially while seeing his uncle laboriously sit back down in his chair, once again groaning slightly as he did so. Despite the very real and noticeable age gap between the two, it was still almost unbelievable just how much older he looked than his sister. Although he could quite literally have been her father age-wise, and even was in a way. It wasn't really usual these days for a sibling to also look the part of a parent. Yet with the Krieger siblings, it would have been easily believable. The years had eaten away at Flynn a lot harder than they had at his sister, and the fact that one of them had raised 3 children while the other abandoned her one most likely had no insubstantial part in that. It also wasn't the only factor, of course, but still. Flynn now invitingly waved them over again, wordlessly urging them to sit down as well. After a moment, they complied, with James sitting down right next to his uncle, while Sheeta pulled up an additional chair next to him that usually stood at the narrow side of the table. Flynn looked over at her with his eyes that were much darker than those of his sister, but still had a similar hazel tone. Then his gaze shifted to meet James's eyes. "I'm guessing she's going to sleep in your room with you?" he posed after a moment, and shifted slightly to talk to the two of them more directly. As if confused at the question, James and Sheeta exchanged a quick glance. "Unless this has become a strictly religious household while I was away, probably," James then replied with a slightly bemused smile. Wouldn't exactly be the first time he had someone over while staying here. Flynn rolled his eyes and made a dismissive smacking sound with his lips. "Just trying to be forthcoming. Who knows what their culture is like?" he grumbled briefly, while rubbing his fingers through the long stubble on his chin. "But in that case, then again, I don't know what's going on with them either." "Them?" Sheeta asked after a moment, her mouth apparently quicker than her thoughts, because she could have likely answered that question for herself if she tried. Flynn nodded over towards the steps. "Girls upstairs," he informed briefly, before extending a long breath and questioningly gazing at James. His eyes betraying a slight awkwardness in his words, he asked, "You think I need to bother with the guest room? I mean, they seem, James chortled slightly. Then he swayed his head left to right. That was a good question. "I think I will go with no," he stated, after a moment of contemplation, before adding, "Yeah, no, 80%. Flynn exhaled through his teeth. "So that's not certain," he mumbled, while Sheeta and Coco both perked up slightly. "Wait, are those two an item?" Sheeta whispered in his ear, sounding almost embarrassed that she wouldn't have picked up on it at this point if they were. James shrugged. "Officially? No," he replied casually, and leaned back a bit while looking up in the vague direction of where he knew Nia's room to be. "At least not yet, but I have a very strong feeling there. I mean, why else would Tuya be staying here instead of home? Certainly not for me." Sheeta made a "that makes sense" sound, and contemplatively lifted her finger to her lips, while her ears folded down, likely while she contemplated either the implications of that, or why the thought seemingly hadn't occurred to her all that much. Coco, on the other hand, leaned slightly over the table. The better question is, do you really think they are that far already? As you said, they haven't even made anything official yet, she murmured, lowering her voice slightly to be absolutely sure no one upstairs would be able to hear her, as she looked at James with impish eyes. James shifted his lips and once again swayed his head. Well, Nia certainly is, he said with certainty, having gotten the feeling all day that his sister was more than ready for some quality time once all the business was over. Bert, on the other hand, I don't know about Tuya though. I mean, I don't know her all that well yet. Then again, she doesn't really seem prudish to me, don't you think? Coco's eyes flashed slightly, and she chuckled. Probably not, she admitted, before tilting her head slightly. But does Nia really move that fast? James just scoffed. Trust me, he said, and now also leaned forward to look directly into Coco's eyes. I know my sister. Suddenly, they both jolted slightly, as Fynn brought his cup down onto the table with a little more force than necessary. When James looked over at him after coming down for the surprise, his uncle made eye contact again. Could you maybe ask her? He requested quietly, and with slight hesitation, clearly not all too comfortable with having to ask that of his nephew. I would do it, but Nia and I, I think it's better if you do it. James gently smiled at him, while Coco spoke up again as well. Well, if it makes things any easier, should he be free, I'd like to maybe take the guest room if that's okay. So clearing that up is probably a good thing anyway. I mean, I certainly wouldn't mind sharing. Keeps the bed nice and warm after all, but I think Tuya might. Fynn groaned, as the entire reason he had asked for the information in the first place had thus been eradicated. Sharing a bed or not, the room would have to be prepared. Slowly, he began to prepare himself to get up. However, before he could even really start, James had his hand on his uncle's shoulder. Don't worry about it, I'll do it, he said, as he pushed himself to his feet. I'll have to go up to ask them anyway. Might as well make the bed while I'm up there. Fynn shook his head slightly. You don't have to, kiddo. That's my job. You have your girl to take care of, he said, and tried to push himself up again, but James stopped him once more. His gaze turning over at Sheeda, he looked at her candidly. You mind waiting a minute, treasure? He asked, to which Sheeda near immediately shook her head. We've been travelling all day, she said with an exhausted sigh, and started to somewhat sprawl out across the table. I'll take the moment to relax when I can get it. And I'll keep her good company, Coco added with a wink, and reached across the table to put her hand on Sheeda's arm. James dismissively rolled his eyes, but turned back to Fynn determinedly. You be a good host. I'll take care of the room, he said with emphasis, and then finally removed his hands from his uncle's shoulders before turning towards the stairs. As he started to walk up, he could hear a sigh behind him, before Flynn's voice asked, So, Sheeda, can I get you anything? Meanwhile, James quickly passed the stairs and ended up in the hallway on the other end, that had doors leading into different rooms at both sides. In order from left to right, he knew them to be a bathroom, an office, Nia's room, the guest room, and storage. As the lights were out, the corridor was quite dark, apart from the light that shone up from downstairs. However, a thin strip of light still cut through the greyly carpeted hall, coming from the slightly ajar door to Nia's room, within which lights were burning brightly. James nodded appreciatively to himself and listened out, but didn't really hear anything over the voices coming from downstairs. Apparently the two weren't talking. Maybe they were listening to something. Either way, he quickly walked up to the door. Not exactly bothering with it, since it was already open, he simply pushed it out of the way and stepped inside while already starting to talk. Hey, hope you don't mind. I've got a brief question for... he began. However, he halted completely as his eyes met with the scene before them. Although the two were quick to correct this circumstance, he still got treated to the brief sight of his colleague on top of his sister, the both of them together in a tight lip lock, while eager hands from both sides had explored the mostly barren torso of the other, as both women had ditched most of their clothes, barring undergarments, seemingly a while ago. Though, as soon as they had realized him coming in, they both had quickly twisted off of each other and pulled up a blanket, covering exactly nothing that James hadn't seen before, in sheepish embarrassment. Tuya, He ended his earlier sentence before letting out a long sigh. Nia just looked at him sheepishly, but Tuya pushed herself up slightly, using one hand to do so, while the other one firmly pressed the blanket against her chest to keep it all covered. "Hey, James," she greeted him, and sounded a lot more nervous than was necessary, while she quickly looked around, almost as if looking for an explanation for a clearly unexplainable situation. Was she trying to play this off? After a few seconds of clearly bruising her brain, and obviously coming up short, she just exhaled, her posture deflating slightly. "Okay, listen, I know this looks bad, but believe me, I'm—" "You know we have locks for a reason, right?" James interrupted her, before she got into whatever explanation or apology she was preparing for there, and he simply gestured towards the very functional lock on Nia's door. "You can also just close the door. I would have knocked. You know I always knock." That last part was directed towards Nia. She chuckled. Sorry. I really thought I did," she gave back in embarrassed amusement. That was clearly more amused than embarrassed, and she, too, now pushed herself more to a sitting position, not bothering with covering her form quite as much as Tuya did. Then she glanced over at her current company and slyly added, "And interrupting to check didn't quite feel worth it." Jamie shook his head with 2 fingers pressed to his brow. "Guess it really is a good thing I came up here," he mumbled more to himself for a second, before turning his gaze up at the two again. "Well, I came up here to ask if we should bother with the guest room for you, but I guess I had my answer. Sorry for the interruption." With that, he quickly pulled back out of the room, that he had barely entered anyway, and demonstratively pulled the door shut with a loud clack, so there would be no doubt that it was closed. However, to his surprise, he didn't quite make it all the way over to the next door, before he heard it being ripped open behind him again. Having apparently abandoned the idea of covering herself, Tuya hastily stepped out into the hall in nothing but her underwear, looking at him with heavy breaths while he confusedly turned towards her, doing his best to keep eye contact given the situation. "Listen, James, I'm sorry," she started, and almost immediately James felt the need to interrupt her again, seeing as there was nothing to apologize for. However, he decided against it after a moment of contemplation, feeling that maybe she just needed to get this off her chest. Therefore, he just indicated for her to go on, while he went to lean against the wall. She nodded back at him almost thankfully, and took up a bit of a more relaxed stance as she continued. "I know it's a cliché, but I really didn't want you to find out like that, okay? I mean, I like to do things properly, really introduce myself, announce the whole thing and so on. This wasn't cool and I want you to know that I know that. You, on the other hand, well, thank you for being cool about it." James exhaled slowly. "Forgiven and forgotten. You're both adults, and by the looks of it, I take it that you are both consenting. Really, nothing else that needs to be minded," he said, feeling that maybe things were done a bit differently where Tuya came from, and or grew up. Saying the obvious aloud might be a source of comfort here, and even then, you're at the very least an okay person. I know for a fact that you've got stable work and don't carry any sicknesses, and if you allow me for a moment of unprofessionalism, I don't have any objections in the looks department either. With a slight laugh, he pushed himself off the wall again and turned, waving with the back of his hand. "And besides all of that, I know exactly where and how to find you if you really hurt my sister," he joked, almost absolutely confident that he would never have to make that threat a reality, if only because Nia was a very tough cookie, and therefore quite hard to really hurt. Therefore he added, "You're fine. Now don't keep her waiting." Then he walked over to the storage room in order to get the necessary sheets to make the bed in the guest room. It didn't exactly take him long to put fresh sheets onto the spare bed, so he already came out of the room after just a few minutes of time. As he did so, he noticed that the door through which light escaped into the hall was not just ajar, but wide open this time. "Seriously?" he yelled over bemusedly, and threw his arms out, even though there was no one there to see it. However, after just a second, Nia's voice replied from out of the room. "You killed the mood!" "Wait!" she then added, and a few seconds later she fully poked her head out of the room, this time clearly dressed in a dark pullover again. As he looked back at her with a questioning gaze, she scrutinizingly scanned him up and down. "Who are you even preparing that room for? I thought you weren't going to bother. Will she "Coco staying the night," he interrupted her with a lifted hand. "So, if you two are looking for company tonight, you only need to look next door." Nia scowled at him darkly for a second, before her expression suddenly shifted into a more challenging one, as she apparently decided to take him up on the teasing. What? She's not staying in your room first? She gave back, and started to fully step out of her doorframe with her arms crossed. That's a first. James actually wasn't all that interested in exchanging barbs, and so he simply shrugged and tried to deflect the conversation. Well, it's the first time she'd staying over. Nia snorted for a second and smirked mischievously. We both know that wouldn't stop her, she commented, when suddenly a muscular arm wrapped around her neck from the door and pulled her in with a brief, surprised shriek. James decided to use this distraction to get out of there while he could, quickly gliding down the stairs and back into the living room. While he was gone, Sheeta had manoeuvred herself from the table over to the couch, sprawling out over the long side while Coco sat next to her head and looked down at her as the two talked. Fynn had remained at the table and watched the women with a restrained smile, while still nursing his cup. Room's ready, James announced to Coco as he stepped in, and she gave him a thankful smile and a thumbs up. Behind him, the sound of more feet on wooden stairs could be heard, as he was followed into the living room by two eager women, who were quietly talking and or bickering with each other. Fynn took that as a sign to stand up, and he loudly clapped his hands. As everyone's gazes shot over to him, he began to address them out with his deep, raspy voice. All right, everyone. I again want to welcome all of you into my humble abode. And since it is such a special occasion, I think it's only right that we get out some of the good stuff to celebrate. Sheeta, Tuya and Coco all looked at him expectantly, as he turned around and walked towards the kitchen. However, their anticipation was slightly interrupted, as James and Nia both let out very knowing groans. That made Sheeta quickly sit up. Should we be worried? She asked, and now looked after Fynn distrustfully, but James waved it off. You'll see, he said, massaging the ridge of his nose. Not long after, Fynn returned with a tray full of glasses, setting down one in front of each of them. Then, from his other hand, he produced a large glass bottle, which he twisted open with a loud hiss. Carefully, he then poured some of its transparent contents into each of their glasses, before finally picking up his own and holding it up. Jump wall, he loudly announced, and lifted the glass a bit higher, encouraging everyone else to do the same. Then they all took a drink. James and Nia, of course, knew what was coming. However, most of the others looked at their drinks confused after a moment. It's just carbonated water? Sheeta quickly added, being the only one who was not socialized to be polite, and not saying anything in such a situation. That's the good stuff? Fynn loudly chuckled. Well, this is not just any water. This, you see, is... he started to boisterously announce. However, James almost immediately cut him off and took the wind out of his sails as he added, a colossal waste of money and resources. Fynn looked disgruntled for a second, but then he shrugged as he looked down at his glass, simply claiming, well, it's worth it for me. Sheeta, apparently not satisfied with that, stared over at James, looking for an explanation. James complied after another sigh. It's diamond water, he said after a moment, and walked over to sit down with her and Coco. Literally one of the dumbest things in existence. They take carbon out of the air, compress it into diamonds, and then use said diamonds to make carbon dioxide, which they then use to carbonate the water, rendering the entire first step absolutely useless. Sheeta furrowed her brows at the explanation, her ears sinking down a bit. Why? She asked, after a very long moment of contemplation. Because you get to drink diamonds, Fynn chimed in with another chuckle. Don't tell me that's not cool. Sheeta just looked more confused. But why diamonds? She asked, and looked back and forth between the two men. Now Nia sighed. Because they used to be valuable once, she informed with a shake of her head. And for some reason people are still holding on to that idea. And companies use that by producing all kinds of useless crap out of diamonds for next to nothing, since someone is going to pay handsomely for it in the end. Fynn also shook his head, and laughed hoarsely with his eyes closed. You kids just don't have any taste for the finer things, he announced, before his cool demeanour was suddenly broken up by a spontaneous yawn escaping his lips, having seemingly snuck up on him. Immediately it infected most of the humans in the room. Well, I think that might be a sign, James mumbled, once he was done expelling the visual clue of his tiredness from his body. Venus has shorter days than this has been. I think I might turn in for the night. He looked over at Shida, who nodded back at him. Everyone else also mirrored the sentiment, as the hours seemingly caught up with them. However, Nia briefly perked up one more time. Oh, can we let the cats out now? She asked. The cats? James replied with a confused look. Yeah, Tuya confirmed for him. We locked them in the bathroom because we didn't know how Shida would react to them. Shida sat with her elbows leaned onto her knees, her ears standing up straight and her tail slightly swaying as she looked around at everybody, and she quietly mumbled, Cats?